Good evening all, and welcome. Houses are our safe havens. However, people who pass through our lives, or perhaps pass through the same land that our house occupies, may not be so willing to leave your house quietly. So get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This happened very recently. My mother and I were driving down the road to the woods so that we could take our puppy for a walk and then post some letters in the village. When we were coming back, it was just starting to get dark, but there was still a good deal of light and I could see fine without my headlights on. For reference, I live on a hill in a very rural area, and as I was driving, I was coming towards my house, which is right on the bend of the road as you come up. There are 2 brick sheds on the left as you approach, which we use, which are across from the lane of my house. There is another lane that runs up the side of my house, which is straight on as you drive up the hill. I have to park a few yards away from my house due to the limited space. So when I come home, I turn right to pass my house, drive down to the barn, and turn around and then drive back up to park besides the road, so that my car is easier to get out of the space again. It's also important to note that these roads are very rarely used by anyone who isn't a neighbor, due to the fact that I live on a private estate, and neither of these roads actually lead anywhere. Anyway, I was driving up the hill with my mum, sitting with the dog in the back, as he's a puppy and we hadn't got a cage for my car yet. I also had a bag full of logs in the boot for the wood stove. As we're coming up the hill, I see what I think is my stepdad walking from one of the sheds across the lane and to the house. When I see him, I mention to my mum that it might be better if she got out of the car right outside the house with the dog and ask my stepdad to take the logs out so that I don't have to carry it all the way up the lane to the house. But then, as we get to the house, we realize 2 things. 1, my stepdad's car is not parked outside the house where it usually is, nor is it parked anywhere else down the lane. And 2, we just saw my stepdad on the way home, finishing up some work he was doing for our landlord. So, who exactly was the person we just saw? As I'm driving down the lane to turn around and park as I usually do, I'm thinking about the person I saw, and am trying not to freak out. It was definitely a man. There was just something about his physique, tall and lanky, and the way he walked, kind of like a swagger, that just made it seem like it was a man and not a woman. He was wearing a black hoodie with the hood up, so I couldn't see his face, as well as a pair of camouflage trousers. This is not the kind of thing my stepdad would wear, not least because he actually doesn't even own any clothes like that. He's also not lanky and doesn't swagger, so it clearly could not have been him. Anyway, we get parked and walk up to the house with the dog and the wood, and then come to the door. The door is unlocked. At this point, my mother is getting very anxious, because even though she did not see the person, she's concerned, because she definitely locked the door behind her. She's borderline paranoid about locking the door, even though we live in the back and beyond, so I believe she locked the door. So she thinks that we might have been mistaken, and for whatever reason my stepdad got a lift home from work and unlocked the door himself. She opens the door and calls out his name, but there's no answer. She hears a bang coming from upstairs that sounded like something was falling off the bed. She tells me to use my key to lock the door, because now it seems someone is actually in the house. I locked the door and ran over to the tool shed to grab a hammer or something. I couldn't find the light switch, so I just grabbed the Stanley knife on the table and ran back with it. My mum told me not to use it because I could get into trouble for using it on someone, even if they were burgling the house. But I was scared out of my wits and had read far too many creepy stories, so I kept it in my hand regardless. My mum phoned my stepdad and told him that there was someone in the house, and he effectively told her to stop panicking because it was unlikely. She explained that I saw someone walking out of our shed, and then she heard something upstairs. At first, he thought we had actually seen him, but he couldn't have returned by the time we got home because we passed him near our landlord's house as we were driving back. He said not to worry and that he would be back in a minute, and my mother hung up. As she unlocked the door, she told me to wait outside with the dog and that she would go investigate. I followed her inside with the wood and the dog and the knife and stood at the front of the stairs as she went to look up. I checked the cupboard and the corner of the dining area and found nothing. Once she came downstairs and found nothing, we relaxed a bit, or she did. I was still freaked out because I had no idea what I had just seen. I too went upstairs to double check. I looked under the beds and in the cupboards, but it was to no avail. I was still freaked out though. I definitely saw someone. So considering it wasn't my stepdad, there were only a few possibilities now. One of my neighbors came over, went into our shed and disappeared into thin air. That must be the case, because they can't access it via their property on the road. I'd just driven down and saw nobody. Or our other neighbor's son who has schizophrenia. He used to be in the army and also wears camo sometimes, and he has a history of wandering around our neighbor's yard and following my neighbor around. Maybe he decided to go into our shed. This was later ruled out when my stepdad got back, because he told us that he knew my neighbor's son was now living in a home for the mentally ill just down the coast. Also, this neighbor's house is at the end of the same street I'd just driven down, so I would have seen him walking down the lane as I drove past to that neighbor's house, turned around and drove back up to park, and I didn't see him or anyone else for that matter. The only explanation is that someone came looking for my stepdad and then walked off somewhere we couldn't see. But I don't know, that'd be really weird. The only road used frequently is the one I drive down. The one other road, which was very rocky and unpaved, that leads to the barn, there's literally nothing at. So I don't know why anyone would go down there. Also, I could see right down this road when I was coming up the hill, and that person literally just disappeared behind my mum's car, where the front door is. As for the bang my mum heard, I honestly think that was just the cat jumping off my bed upstairs. But in the moment it was scary, because I'd also seen someone walking across the lane to the house, and the adrenaline was pumping. I really don't know what it was. I do know the figure was solid enough for me to think it was an actual person. I also know this isn't the first time we have seen and heard unexplainable things in our house. 2 days after we moved in, my mum and I both heard what sounded like my voice downstairs saying, "Oh, what?" And we both thought that the other had said it. I don't sound like my mum at all, really. But when you hear a female voice, your brain kind of makes sense of it and assumes it's the only other person it could be, which in my case was my mum. It was only after I found out that it wasn't my mum that I thought back to the sound and realized it really sounded more like my own voice than hers. My mum has also seen a very solid looking cat, a totally different coloured one to R2, walking up to the door as if it was going to go out the cat flap, and then no cat flap sound. When she went to look, the cat was not there, or outside, and both our cats were still upstairs. She's also seen a small white dog appear out of nowhere and seemingly disappear, and saw someone's arms pulling out the drawers of her dresser when she was outside looking into the bedroom window. She assumed it was my stepdad, only for him to tell her that he hadn't even got out of bed yet. What creeps me out about this one is that my stepdad's workmate has seen someone walking out of our shed before too. He came to pick him up for work one time and was waiting by the house when he saw what he thought was my stepdad come out of the shed, walk through the gates beside it, and disappear behind the building. When my stepdad then walked out of the house, he was obviously pretty surprised. I've had many encounters with ghosts, but this is the first time I've seen a solid apparition in this place. Considering that the house is probably about 400 to 500 years old, I guess it's not that weird. Plus, there's a story of a former resident who was a gameskeeper, having shot himself a few decades ago, which would explain some stuff, like maybe the camo trousers. I'm not sure, but I'm really freaked out. My mum and dad split up when I was about 2. My dad eventually ended up with his current wife, my stepmother, and they moved quite far away. Me and my older brother Bob would go up and see him once a month. When he first moved away, he lived in this big house that was set out really odd. You'd enter the house into a tiny hallway, with the front room on the right, a dining room to the left. You'd walk through the dining room to the kitchen, which had the back door to the garden, as well as having the bathroom and toilet attached to the kitchen. Super weird. Upstairs was my dad's bedroom to the right, above the front room, and to the left was a really long hallway. About halfway down the hallway was my brother's room. To the left, if you were just walking down the hallway, and at the end, you came face to face with the door to my room. So, the story goes that the place was haunted. I was reasonably young, about 11 or 12. They didn't want to tell me about it because they thought I'd get scared, which I understand. I found out later of the things that had happened to them whilst in the home. My stepmother had an incident where she was in her bedroom doing her hair in the mirror. She looked up in the mirror and saw a young girl standing behind her with her arms crossed over her chest. My stepmother squealed, closed her eyes, and put her head in her hands. And when she looked up, the girl was gone. There were plenty of other instances of doors opening and closing, footsteps up and down the long hall, knocking about in the attic as well as the dogs acting strange, and we had 2 huge Rottweilers. One day I was staying the weekend, and I felt really sick. My family had made plans to go out, but I didn't feel up for it. They decided to leave me at home on my dad's PC in the care of the dogs. They didn't want to let me be alone in case something happened. While I was playing on the PC, the dogs went really weird. They were normally quite docile, really friendly and extremely loving. Well, they started running about the front room barking. Every once in a while, they would stop and just aggressively growl at the fireplace. I stopped and tried to calm them down, but as I knelt next to them, one of them turned and bit me on the face. He was immediately apologetic, licking and whimpering, whilst asking for cuddles, but I was scared and hurting a bit. He didn't even break the skin, so it wasn't a bad bite, and I felt like I was going to puke. I ran to the bathroom, and the family got home. I told them what happened and they looked really concerned, but told me not to worry and to keep an eye on us. A little something about my room. It was dark and really small. It had a tiny window as well as 2 huge wardrobes in the corner. I never really felt comfy in that room. I hated being able to see the bedroom door, and I have no idea why. I often read in bed, and then try to sleep on the floor, which is really odd now that I think back on it. I couldn't get comfy on that bed, and always had an impending feeling of unsafe. Later that night, we all went to bed. Now, I like to read before going to sleep, so I was reading to myself, as I was slowly drifting off to sleep, when the bedroom started screaming. I know that sounds bizarre, but there was just this insanely loud scream coming from the room. I had no idea what was going on, so I immediately panicked. Who wouldn't? I tried to open my door and it wouldn't budge. I could hear my brother on the other side of the door also trying to open it, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. The scream was just too loud. I heard thumps outside the door, and I had no clue what was happening and just kept trying to open the door whilst crying. Suddenly the screaming stopped, and the door opened. My brother, dad, and stepmother were just standing there staring at me. I was sobbing, and my brother hugged me, and my dad asked me why I was screaming and whether I saw the girl. I said I wasn't, and my brother confirmed that he could hear me saying, "What?" throughout the screaming. I stayed in my brother's room that night. The next time I went to my dad's, he had moved homes. I heard the other stories years later. I'd hear other stories about the fireplace being pulled out and things being found, but to be honest, they sounded a bit far-fetched to me. I know this story might sound it too, but I know it happened because I lived it. I have never shared this story before. This happened when I was 10 or 11. I was living with my mum and sister in a super old rural farmhouse, probably from the early 1900s in Northern California, the town of Loomis. It was a basic 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom house with a cellar and attic, and lots of land for horses and fruit trees. So one hot summer day, when my sister, mother, and I were all home, I was playing Warcraft 2 or something on my computer, and started to hear extremely loud and violent banging on the wall. It was literally rattling on the windows. Being rather absorbed in my gameplay, I let it go until a few minutes had passed, at which point my confusion meter had reached its limits, and I had to figure out what was causing it. Naturally, I assumed it was my sister, who was 16 at the time and was being stupid, kicking the walls with both legs. That's how loud it sounded. But she wasn't. In fact, she assumed I was doing the same. It confused both of us, because it was even louder than we thought a person could kick the wall. It sounded like a freaking car ran into the house over and over for several hours. We grabbed our mum, who indicated she heard the same thing. None of us were doing it. We looked on the roof and in the attic, both of which were totally clear. The pipes, the plumbing, and the electrical had never made such violent noises before, and were not causing them now. So we were totally at a loss as to what was making these horrible violent bangs. It shook the window panes and could be heard through the entire house. No way could it have been an earthquake, because the floor wasn't shaking. We just heard such loud banging. Coincidentally, this was the same day a family friend's son had died, although I don't know why that would have anything to do with it. Some other creepy stuff happened in the house, not on the same day, but throughout the 3 years that we lived there. I would feel a presence walk out of my mum's bedroom and through the living room behind me when I was there playing video games. My mum also dreamt that a brown smoke was trying to enter her abdomen. She was paralyzed and couldn't scream, but I heard her struggling through the wall. We had a weird shared closet with a door in between our rooms and woke her up. Another time I went down to the basement to look for something. I seem to remember I was checking on the kittens, to which our cat had given birth to down there, and a strange black mist slowly covered my foot, promptly making me get the hell out of there, and I never returned. I'm guessing that this all had to do with the fact that my mum practiced witchcraft and was actually in a coven for years. But I'm not sure. We never determined the source. My dad also went on to die probably less than a year after this, and we were still living there. Perhaps it was a strange premonition. I would love to hear your thoughts. A bit of context. I live in a one-story house with a bayou behind it. We have railings on our windows/doors because we've been broken into in the past. I've never really been afraid to stay home alone until recently. I always felt something unworldly in our home. A long time ago, we had this scary incident. My younger sister and I shared a bedroom when we were kids. Our family was religious, so we had a cross in the wall between the two of our beds. We went to a party one day with our entire family and stayed there for a few hours. I want to make it clear that everybody went to the party. My mom, dad, older sister, younger brother and I all went. We came back home and I saw that the cross that was hanging between our beds was missing. I checked under the bed, and there it was under my sister's bed. To this day, I have no explanation for it. My parents were also shocked, but didn't think much, so we put it back on the wall, and nothing had happened to it since. That was my first real encounter with something strange. There were times where I'd lay in my bed playing with my DS, when the TV would all of a sudden turn on by itself. I had to stand up to turn it off, but it would continually turn itself on 2 or 3 times later. I wasn't sitting on a remote or anything. Everything just remained normal for a few years, but then things began picking up again. There was a time when my sister had her door knocked on and blamed me for doing it. I told her that I never touched her door, and things felt uneasy again. On another occasion, my door opened entirely by itself one day. All of the windows were closed and only the AC was on. The door was slightly cracked, but I don't believe the AC would just open the door the entire way slowly by itself. This was a recent incident, perhaps a year ago, but it scared the life out of me. I was just alone in bed, browsing on Twitter when I heard this noise. I can promise anyone that it wasn't the Candy Crush game music, because I heard the crushing of candy leaves and the distinct yum from the game. The music was also really familiar, since I played it a lot in middle school. It sounded very clear and I knew it was real. It sounded as if someone was actively playing it. I was home alone, and it freaked me out. My dad was at work, my younger brother was at school, and my sister was walking home with a friend. Once I stood up to investigate the music, it stopped. The music skipped. My heart sank. Goosebumps flooded my arms, and I bolted to my front door and stayed outside until my sister came home. I wish I had recorded the audio, because it would have made her believe me. This incident scared me incredibly. Now I'm sharing this as other things keep happening. I'm home alone and I keep hearing this toy go off. It sounds like an elephant toy with a honking sound, and it's going off during random intervals. When I go to see what it is, nothing's there. I'm completely paranoid and freaking out at the moment. I lived in a house that was haunted. My room must have been the worst area because my siblings and stepdad did hear and see things, but I got something just about every night that would happen. Constant footsteps and the feeling of being watched. Walking through my room, I'd suddenly hit spots that were freezing cold. The typical ghost signs everyone hears about in movies. But it got stranger when it followed us to our next house, and got worse to the point that my mum finally believed me when she saw a hand reaching from underneath a door right next to her. After 3 weeks of living in that house, my cat scratched my arm pretty deeply when I picked her up, and then we didn't see her for a week. We were searching like crazy. We went back to our old house and found her inside and completely shut and locked in the boarded up house. It was an old farmhouse and we got evicted, and she was inside a closet upstairs with the door closed in on her, and the door even opened outwards, so she couldn't have closed it on herself easily. Luckily, she was still alive, but nearly starved to death. Everything continued and just got worse. Hearing the thuds of someone hammering their fists on the walls would wake me up every single night, but I always would wake up at a different time. It would do 3 to wake me up. Then, as if to prove to me that it wasn't just my imagination when I woke up, it would do 1 more and stop every night. Then we found out that my mum's ex-husband had touched my brother inappropriately. A while after we found out, I was alone in my room at night. I wished that he would die, and I immediately heard a thump on the wall. He killed himself within the week. However, the spooky things didn't stop there. The first thing that ever happened at the house, actually, was shortly after we moved in, and it was one of the few times that it wasn't me it happened to. My stepdad was downstairs at the house watching TV, when we heard someone running across the floor upstairs heading towards his model train room. He thought I was still home, since I was the only one with a room upstairs. He grabbed his 2x4 that had a handle on it, and started heading towards the stairs to go paddle my ass, since I wasn't allowed in there, when he started hearing really loud thuds. He said it was like someone was up there knocking bureaus and throwing his boxes of trains. He said he began yelling, and it kept going. Then halfway up the stairs it got dead quiet, and he started to think that it wasn't me, since I didn't answer when he called. So he went back downstairs and got his gun. When he went back, everything was exactly how it was left. This was the only reason he started believing me when things happened. My mum wasn't convinced at all. Every night I heard footsteps on the ceiling above my room, without fail. There would be also a lot of thuds that sounded like they were coming from random spots on my wall. There was one night where it was happening every time I would finally think it was over. Just set slow thuds over and over again, 2 to 4 at a time, pausing every few seconds between each knock. My mum heard it from their bedroom and was relatively close by one when I had already fallen asleep, and sent Shane to come and yell at me. But on his way over he could hear the knocking right on the door of my bedroom. He opened it and I was passed out on my bed. I woke up to him listening to the wall, trying to find out where the noise was coming from at about 3 a.m. One day, I was with my brother downstairs, switching off while playing Big Mouth the Truckers, and we heard running footsteps coming from my room. My brother hadn't any experiences with it, even though his room is directly beneath mine. and he got really nervous when I casually mentioned that it was the ghost and would stop if we ignored it. Being a mean older brother and having gotten used to it, I offered to go investigate with him. Again, he stopped on our way up the stairs. My brother was so scared at this point. He brought a steak knife with him. And to give you an idea of the surroundings, my room at the time was absolutely huge. Like, so big that I just arranged my furniture to only use half of it, because I didn't have much stuff. On the side of the room I didn't use, there was a closet that I always covered up with a sheet, because it made me nervous at night, with all the noises going on. When we walked through the doorway, the first thing we noticed was that the sheet was blown way up into the air, even through there, despite the fact that there was no wind in the room, and no window was open upstairs. By this point I was too afraid, and my brother was running down the stairs before the sheet had time to settle. For some reason I had courage that day and went to take a look, but when I got close I could hear scratching as well as relieved thinking that it was just the cat. But I looked around the inside and couldn't see her, but could still hear the scratching. It sounded just like a cat trying to get through an open door. When I listened closely, I could hear it coming from the left wall, and I put my hand on the wall and felt it move. And then I realized that it wasn't the wall, and it was just one of those boards that you would put tool hangers on and stuff, where it has all those tiny holes all throughout the board that the legs of the hangers insert into. When it fell away, I felt a freezing burst of air to my face that sent me running out of the house. When my parents finally got home, we went and looked at it. There was a small crevice behind it that was probably about 3 foot high and a couple of feet deep. All I could picture was my imagination, with a 5-year-old kid curled up and hiding in there. The next time my family was gone, I boarded the damn thing up with plywood and covered it up with a sheet. But every now and then, I would see the sheet kick up, like there was a breeze coming through it. One morning months after this, I woke up and my arm was itching like crazy. I felt a bit of a jump with my hand and thought it was mosquito bite, but then I realized it wasn't just a little round bug bite. It was like a bump forming a line. So I finally sat up and pulled my shirt off to look at where I had felt it. On my left bicep right below my shoulders, there was a red mark in the shape of a hand. I really don't know how to explain it, but it was pretty much indented on my skin, and the bump I felt was the outline. The hand was tiny and only had 3 fingers and a thumb, but it didn't look like it was missing a finger. It just looked like it had the hand that only was supposed to have 3 fingers. I would say it wasn't much bigger than a 10-year-old's hand. It was also a left hand print from what I could tell. I sat there for at least 15 minutes trying to lay my hand on it in a way that would match up, but it didn't seem possible. It was still bright red when I decided to leave my room for the second time, and I got downstairs to show my mother, but it was gone. I had thought for sure that she would believe me if she had seen it. Then we moved into a second house, and things died down for 3 to 4 weeks, until my mum was working with my stepdad on our bathroom, and she was sitting on the floor just outside the door, passing tools and such. She noticed a hand reaching under the door to my brother's room. She thought it was my brother trying to scare her, so she quickly opens the door to bonk him on the head. But, just like before, he was in his bed fast asleep, all the way on the other side of the room. She finally believed me after that. It was only 2 to 3 days after this that the cat went missing, and we found her in the old house locked in the closet. Things started back up again with the footsteps and thumping. A lot of stuff happened in between. I was stressed and depressed, about as far as anyone could possibly go. I was constantly berated at school, and had recently been beaten up by 5 of those kids. I was getting hit and verbally abused about daily, but my arsehat stepfather had to work on the farm almost all the time, before and after school, and had recently found out that my brother had been touched inappropriately by my previous stepfather. I was never touched to that level, but some things came to light in my mind that still haunt me, and the year before my best friend / brother had died of cancer. I was only 13, but I really wanted life to end at that point. I went out to our big barn in the middle of the night and got a rope. On the 2nd floor of the barn was a huge window. I was sitting on the window crying when I got cold and looked behind me. I could see someone standing in the corner of the barn. I saw that often in the barns, but always out of the corner of my eye. This time I stared. I must have sat there staring for a solid 2 minutes, and I started calmly talking, telling it how much I didn't care anymore. I taunted it. I wanted it to push me out the window so I didn't have to do it myself. It just stood there completely black and completely silent. Eventually, I just got angry and told it to piss off, and that I'm done with everything. And so I went back inside, and that's when I grabbed the 2x4 and just went into my parents' room and hit him as hard as I could with it. I was a coward, so I only hit his arm, but he woke up and I ran. He chased me outside in his boxers and grabbed the first thing that he could see, one of those adjustable wrenches, and threw it at my back, but I kept on running. My mum finally left him when I told her that I had been thinking about ending it all. Well, she left him for about a month before they got back together. But what it did accomplish was moving far away from that area for good, and when they got back together, he moved to where we were living. I haven't been haunted, except for 2 strange dreams that were ridiculously vivid out-of-body experiences, where I came back to find a girl that was with me in my bed. She was being ripped apart by a completely black, small figure of a boy. They just looked and felt so real. I remember feeling burning on my arm and feeling the warmth of blood getting on my face when I walked into the room, but nothing else had actually happened, except for when I went back to the farm earlier this year during the summer, which was very unsettling, as I'm still confused as to what the hell was going on there. I live in a very old house, and I have lived here since I was 4. I'm 22 now. A lot of strange occurrences have happened here, the main one being that I woke up in the very early hours of the morning to see a young boy messing about with the sink that I had in my room at the time. He wasn't looking at me. He seemed almost not there, but I could see him. When I managed to pluck up the courage to go and see my parents, I left him in my room. My parents were very understanding. Turns out years later, when they told my sister and me, we had quite a few spirits in the house, and I described this lad to them, as they had seen him and knew I wasn't making it up. There was always singing in the house too. Never an actual source, just humming and singing floating around. My sister and mother and I had things go missing, turned up in a room, and on return, her diary, which had gone missing a few days earlier, was just sitting on the middle of the floor despite not being there mere moments ago. A lot of this I was too young to understand, but when my parents sat us down and told me everything, it scared the crap out of me for a good while. We still have random unexplained things happen to us, but we can just talk about it and wonder who or what it could be. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's video. I've always wanted to visit a haunted house, but I'm afraid something will happen to our baby whilst we're there. If you enjoyed tonight's video, don't forget to drop a like, leave a comment with your thoughts, And if you're new, press the bell icon and subscribe to be notified every time I post, which is pretty much every night. If there's a story that you wish to share, you can send it to my email or my Reddit page. The links to both are available in the description. But with that being said, it's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.